Welcome to Deep Sleep Stories. This is where your evening journey into the world of peace, dreams, and cozy stories begins. Take a deep breath. Exhale. Let go of the worries of the day and allow yourself to relax. Make yourself comfortable, close your eyes, and immerse yourself in peace. Let's also start our story. The lighthouse stood alone on the edge of the world, its great beacon casting a golden glow across the restless sea. The night air smelled of salt and distant storms, and the waves crashed against the cliffs below with the steady rhythm of an old sailor's heartbeat. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, filling the stone walls with flickering light and warmth. Thomas sat in his worn armchair, his hands wrapped around a tin mug of steaming tea. His beard was streaked with silver, his face lined with years spent under the sun and wind, but his eyes, sharp and ocean blue, held the weight of stories untold. Across from him, perched on a low wooden stool, sat Samuel, a boy of no more than 12. His hair was windswept, his cheeks still flushed from the cold outside, and his eager eyes reflected the firelight. He had been coming to the lighthouse for weeks now, pestering Thomas for stories of the sea. And tonight, Thomas had finally decided to tell him the one that mattered most. "You ever heard the tale of the storm chaser?" Thomas asked, his voice low and steady, carrying the rhythm of a man who had spent years speaking over howling winds and roaring waves. Samuel shook his head, his fingers gripping the edge of his stool. "No." "Was she your ship?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Aye. The finest ship I ever sailed. Fast as a gull, strong as iron, and more stubborn than the men who crewed her. She carried us across endless miles of ocean, through tempests and battles, through riches and ruin. And she was the last ship I ever set foot on as a sailor." The boy leaned in, eyes wide. "What happened to her?" Thomas took a slow sip of his tea before answering. "She met her match." He stared into the fire, watching the embers glow like dying stars. "And so did I." Samuel swallowed. "Was it a storm?" Thomas shook his head. "Worse. A man. A man named Elias Graves." The wind outside howled suddenly, rattling the window panes, as if the sea itself remembered the name. "We were sailing the warm waters of the southern seas," Thomas continued, his voice carrying Samuel away from the lighthouse and back in time. "Captain Vane, our fearless leader, had a reputation. Some called him a hero, others a menace. He had no love for pirates, nor for those who preyed on the weak. And in those days, there was no name more feared among honest sailors than Elias Graves." Samuel's voice was barely a whisper. "Who was he?" Thomas's fingers traced the rim of his mug. "A man without mercy. He captained the Widow's Grasp, a ship black as midnight, with sails that swallowed the moonlight. He and his crew didn't take prisoners. They took what they wanted and left nothing behind but wreckage and ghosts." Samuel shuddered, but Thomas continued. "We never meant to cross paths with him. But fate has a way of dragging men into storms they aren't ready for. And so, one fateful night, beneath a sky heavy with rain and the promise of blood, the storm chaser found herself in the sights of the Widow's Grasp." Samuel's breath quickened as he imagined the scene, two ships in the open sea, one a predator, the other its prey. He could almost hear the wind howling through the rigging, the snap of sails as they filled with the night breeze, the faint creak of wood as the sea swelled beneath them. Thomas leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "We spotted her at dusk, just a shadow on the horizon at first. But as night fell, she drew closer, her black sails cutting across the silver-streaked waves like a blade through silk. At first, we weren't sure if she had seen us. We held our breath, watching, waiting, but the moment her lanterns flickered to life, casting a sickly glow upon the water, we knew. The Widow's Grasp was hunting." Samuel gripped the stool, his knuckles white. What did you do?" "We ran," Thomas said simply. Captain Vane gave the order, and we threw every bit of canvas we had into the wind. The storm chaser was built for speed, but Graves' ship, she was a thing of nightmares. No matter how we pushed her, no matter how we angled the sails, the Widow's grasp kept gaining. It was like she was alive, like she had tasted our fear and wanted more. The fire popped in the hearth, making Samuel jump. He exhaled, heart pounding. "Did you think you'd get away?" Thomas's lips pressed into a thin line. For a time, we dared to hope. The wind was in our favor, the sea carried us fast, and every sailor on board worked as if the devil himself was on our heels. But then, just past midnight, we heard it. Samuel leaned forward. "Heard what?" Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. "The first cannon." The lighthouse groaned as a gust of wind slammed against its walls, making the wooden beams creak. Samuel barely noticed, he was lost in the world of Thomas's memory, standing there on the deck of the storm chaser, feeling the spray of salt against his skin, hearing the deep, thunderous boom of a cannon tearing through the night. Thomas opened his eyes, meeting the boy's gaze. "And that's where the battle began, lad. That's where the real nightmare started." Samuel swallowed hard, gripping the stool tighter. "And then?" Thomas set his mug down and leaned forward, his voice barely more than a whisper. "And then, lad, the real story began." For hours, the chase had raged across the open sea. The storm chaser sliced through the water, her sails stretched to their limits, but no matter how fast she ran, the Widow's grasp pursued her like a shadow. The wind was fierce, whipping through the rigging, and the ocean churned beneath them, as if the very sea itself feared the coming battle. "They're gaining," a voice cried from above. The lookout, perched high in the crow's nest, waved frantically. "They'll be on us before dawn." Captain Vane's face was grim. "Not if I can help it." He turned to the helmsman. "Turn south, ride the current. If we can reach the reef before them, we might have a chance." Thomas, gripping the rigging, watched as the black ship loomed closer. Every lantern on the Widow's grasp flickered like the eyes of a predator. Then, without warning, a flash of fire erupted from her bow, cannons roared, and the night was shattered. The first cannonball struck the water just off the storm chaser's stern, sending up a massive spray that rained over the deck. The next one found its mark, smashing through the railing in an explosion of splinters. Men ducked and cursed, gripping whatever they could as the ship rocked from the impact. "Return fire!" Vane bellowed. The crew sprang into action, rushing to the cannons. Smoke filled the air as they fired back, the thunderous booms rolling across the waves. The sea between the ships churned with missed shots, cannonballs crashing into the water like falling stars. But the Widow's grasp did not slow. Thomas's pulse pounded as the enemy ship closed the distance. They weren't just chasing anymore. They were coming to board. The night exploded into chaos. A barrage of grappling hooks shot from the Widow's grasp, their iron tips latching onto the storm chaser's rails with deadly precision. The enemy crew howled as they pulled themselves across the gap, their swords gleaming under the moonlight. Captain Vane drew his cutlass and roared, "Prepare for boarding." Sailors rushed to defend the deck, blades flashing as steel met steel. Thomas barely had time to draw his own sword before an enemy pirate leaped onto the deck before him. The man's grin was wild, his teeth yellowed and broken. He swung his cutlass with brutal force, forcing Thomas to parry quickly. Sparks flew as their swords clashed. Thomas ducked low, sidestepping the pirate's second swing, and drove his blade forward, cutting through cloth and flesh. The man let out a strangled gasp before falling to the deck. Gunshots rang out across the ship as pistol fire erupted from both sides. The smell of gunpowder mixed with salt and sweat, the air thick with smoke. Thomas turned just in time to see Captain Vane engaged in a deadly duel with a towering figure, Elias Graves himself. The infamous captain fought with a ruthless efficiency, his every strike meant to kill. Vane countered with expert skill, but Thomas could see the grim determination in Graves' eyes. "Thomas," a voice shouted. He turned to see his friend, Marcus, struggling against two enemies at once. Without hesitation, Thomas lunged forward, cutting through one of them and forcing the other back. But as the battle raged on, Thomas knew one thing: this fight was far from over. The battle on the deck of the storm chaser raged with the fury of the storm-tossed sea. The cries of the wounded mixed with the thunder of cannons and the clash of steel. The flickering light of the lanterns cast long shadows over the wooden planks, now slick with blood. Thomas stood at the stern, breathing heavily, his sword clenched tightly in his grip. He had just parried another attack when his gaze locked onto Elias Graves, who was overpowering Captain Wayne. Graves' movements were precise, relentless. Wayne fought with everything he had, but Thomas could see the exhaustion setting in. "Wayne!" Thomas shouted, charging forward, but his path was blocked by a towering, broad-shouldered pirate with a scar over one eye. The man sneered, brandishing a cutlass. "And where do you think you're going, lad?" he mocked before swinging his blade. Thomas barely managed to deflect the blow, feeling the cold steel whistle dangerously close to his face. Meanwhile, the storm chaser groaned as another cannonball struck its hull. Water began flooding the lower decks, the wooden beams creaking under the strain of the surging waves. The enemy swarmed aboard like a relentless tide, overwhelming the crew. Thomas gritted his teeth and, seizing the moment, lunged forward. His sword cut through the air, finding its mark. The pirate stumbled back, clutching his side where a dark stain of blood spread across his coat. "This isn't over yet," the man snarled, but Thomas was already moving, fighting his way toward the captain. At last, he reached Wayne's side. The captain, battered and struggling, clutched his sword with trembling hands, his tattered coat hanging loosely from his shoulders. Graves stood before him, his deadly cutlass glinting in the dim light. "Surrender, Wayne," Graves said coolly, his voice like the howling wind. "This ship is mine now." "Go to hell," Wayne rasped before launching himself into another desperate attack. They clashed again, their strikes swift and deadly, but Thomas could see the captain faltering. Blood trickled from his arm, his movement slowing. One misstep was all it took. Graves hooked Wayne's sword with his own and slammed the hilt into his gut. The captain staggered and collapsed onto the deck. Thomas rushed to him, attempting to lift him, but it was too late. The pirates had encircled them, weapons raised. Graves' laughter echoed over the deck. "Well then, lads," he said, turning to his men. "Let's finish this once and for all." The rain poured harder, lightning splitting the sky. Thomas knew their chances of escape were slim. But he wasn't going down without a fight. Thomas had no choice. Surrounded on all sides by Graves' men, his mind raced for a way out. The sea roared below, the ship rocked violently, and the scent of gunpowder and blood filled the air. A desperate idea formed in his mind. It was madness, but it was the only chance he had. With a sudden roar, Thomas lunged forward, surprising the nearest pirate. He knocked the man's cutlass from his hand and grabbed the pistol from his belt. Without hesitation, he fired, the shot cutting through the howling wind and striking another pirate in the shoulder. The momentary distraction was all he needed. He dove to the deck, rolling beneath a swinging blade, and made a break for the railing. But before he could reach it, a powerful hand clamped around his wrist. "Graves! You're not going anywhere, boy," the pirate snarled, his grip like iron. "You'll either serve under my flag or sink with your ship." Thomas struggled, but Graves was too strong. The pirate yanked him forward, his blade pressed against Thomas's throat. Then, from below deck, a massive explosion shook the ship. A blast of fire erupted from the hold, sending wooden planks and debris into the air. The storm chaser groaned in agony, splitting apart at the seams. The gunpowder stores had ignited. The deck tilted sharply, and in the chaos, Thomas wrenched himself free. Without thinking, he threw himself overboard into the raging sea below. The cold struck him like a hammer. The waves pulled at him, dragging him beneath the surface. He fought against the current, struggling to keep his head above water. Through the flashes of lightning, he saw the storm chaser breaking apart, swallowed by fire and waves alike. The Black Viper, too, had been caught in the blast, its mast snapped in two. Thomas gasped for air, the salt burning his throat. Darkness threatened to consume him, but he forced himself to stay awake. He couldn't die here. He wouldn't. Then, through the chaos, he spotted a piece of wreckage floating nearby. Summoning the last of his strength, he reached for it, clinging to the broken beam as the storm carried him away into the unknown. Thomas clung to the wreckage, his body battered by the merciless waves. Salt burned his eyes, his limbs ached with exhaustion, and the cold gnawed at his bones like a starving beast. The storm had carried him far from the wreckage of the storm chaser and the Black Viper, leaving him alone in the vast, moonlit ocean. Hours passed. The storm eventually faded, leaving behind a vast, eerie stillness. The sea stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface dark and unknowable. The only sounds were the gentle slosh of water against his makeshift raft and the distant cries of gulls. His throat was parched, his stomach empty, but worse than his physical pain was the crushing loneliness. Was he the only survivor? Had Captain Wayne perished in the explosion? Had Graves managed to escape? Then, movement. Something brushed against his leg beneath the surface. His breath caught in his throat. The ocean was home to more than just men. A dark shape circled beneath him. A fin broke the surface. Sharks. Panic surged through Thomas's veins. He gripped his wooden plank tighter, forcing himself to remain still. His mind raced. The blood from the battle, was it still in the water? Had it drawn them here? The fin vanished beneath the waves. Silence. Then, a sudden jolt. The wreckage beneath him rocked violently as something struck it from below. Thomas nearly lost his grip. His heart pounded in his chest as another shape streaked past him in the water, its sleek body barely visible in the moonlight. He had to move. With every ounce of strength left in him, he paddled toward what looked like a distant shadow on the horizon, an island. Or just another trick of the sea. He didn't care. He had to reach it. His arms screamed in protest, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he pushed forward. A sudden splash behind him. The water churned. Something was coming. Desperate, he kicked harder, the wooden plank barely staying afloat beneath him. The shadow ahead grew larger, it was real. An island, rocky and foreboding, but salvation nonetheless. He was close. So close. Then, a sharp pain seared through his leg. A cry tore from his lips as something latched onto him, dragging him down. His fingers clawed at the wood, his lungs burned for air. The deep was calling for him, pulling him into its black embrace. Summoning the last of his strength, he twisted, his free foot striking out wildly. His heel connected with something solid, and suddenly the grip loosened. Kicking furiously, he broke the surface, gasping for air. His vision blurred, his limbs weak, but the island was only a few strokes away. He forced himself forward, inch by inch, until his fingers scraped against sand. With the last shreds of his strength, he dragged himself onto the shore, collapsing onto the wet, gritty surface. The world spun around him, his breath ragged. The salty wind stung his wounds, but he was alive. For the first time since the battle, Thomas allowed himself to close his eyes. But as the tide lapped at his feet and the distant cries of unseen creatures echoed from the jungle beyond, he knew his fight for survival was far from over. Thomas moved, his body aching from exhaustion. The rough sand clung to his skin as he slowly rose, squinting against the harsh morning light. The storm had long passed, leaving behind a peaceful blue sky. But the calm was deceptive. He was alone on an uncharted island, and the jungle in front of him was full of mysteries. He turned his gaze back to the sea. The wreckage of the storm chaser had disappeared, swallowed by the abyss. No trace of Captain Wayne, nor of any crew. A lump formed in his throat. He had not merely ended up on the island, he was lost. But to survive, action was necessary. He checked his wounds. His leg, though torn by a shark's bite, was no longer bleeding as heavily. He could still move. He gritted his teeth and hobbled toward the edge of the forest. The jungle was vast, dark, and dense. He needed food, water, and shelter. Moving cautiously, he stepped into the green labyrinth. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and foreign flowers. Leaves rustled, and invisible creatures darted through the underbrush. Every sound made him tense. He had faced the chaos of the sea, the brutality of pirates, but something in this place felt different. Something unseen was watching him. He continued on. Hours passed as he made his way through towering trees and tangled roots. Hunger gnawed at his insides. Then, hope. A bush with low-hanging, golden, juicy fruits dangled from a tree. He grabbed one, sliced open the skin, and began to eat greedily, letting the sweet juice drip down his chin. And then he froze. A shadow moved in the distance. Thomas held his breath. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but then he saw it again. A figure, human in shape, but fast, disappearing into the brush. Thomas's heart raced. Was he truly alone? He grabbed a sturdy branch as a weapon and, cautiously, began to creep forward. He had spent his entire life among sailors, but caution was not his strong suit. Still, he tried, step by step, following the movements that led deeper into the jungle. And then, tracks. Fresh, pressed into the damp earth. Not his. Someone was here. A rustle to the left. He spun around, bringing the branch forward, his eyes darting between the trees. The jungle fell silent, as if holding its breath. Then, a whisper. It wasn't the wind. A voice. Before he could react, something shot out of the bushes. The figure lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. Thomas scrambled, tossing dirt and leaves. His attacker was fast, lean, and strong, but Thomas had fought for his life too many times to give up now. He curled up, pushing the opponent away, and managed to rise to his feet. Now, face to face, he could see who, or what, he was dealing with. A man. Or at least what was left of one. His clothes were torn rags, his face covered in dirt and an unkempt beard. His eyes were wild, filled with a mix of fear and rage. And in his hand, a knife. Thomas slowly raised his hands. I don't want to fight. The wild man narrowed his eyes. His fingers gripped the knife handle tightly, but he hesitated. A moment of silence stretched between them. Then the stranger spoke, his voice hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in years. Thomas kept his hands raised, his heart racing, but he tried to stay calm. The wild man with the knife stood before him, his gaze as harsh as ever, and his fingers tightened around the blade, ready to strike. Thomas knew he couldn't let himself be intimidated, so he attempted to explain his situation. I'm Thomas Hale, he said, his voice heavy with fatigue and dehydration. I was on a ship, our ship sank during the storm. I'm on this island, just like you. I need food, water, and shelter." The wild man didn't respond, just stared at him as though trying to decide whether to trust him. His eyes were deep and distant, and his body still brimming with tension, ready for any threat. "And you?" Thomas paused, trying to find the right words. "How did you end up here? How long have you been here?" The man didn't answer immediately. He clenched the knife, as if considering whether to reveal his world to this stranger. After a moment, he finally spoke. "Elias, my name is Elias." Thomas tried to take a step closer, but the man immediately raised the knife, forcing him to stop. "Don't come closer," he said coldly, though his voice softened. "It's dangerous here for people like you. And for me too." Suddenly, right in front of Thomas, there was movement again. The wind broke the silence, and from the thicket, another man emerged. Tall and with a strong appearance. Thomas instantly realized this was not the person he had been expecting. "Elias?" Thomas said in surprise, looking at the stranger who had come closer. This was the same man who had attacked him moments ago. But this figure had a different aura, more familiar, more known. The man he saw now was one of those he had seen on the ship before. Elias froze. His expression turned confused and uncertain as their eyes met. You're alive," he muttered in disbelief. Thomas felt his heart stop. This man, his face was familiar. Elias, one of those who seemed to have been part of the Tempest's Wrath crew. How had he ended up here? What happened? Thomas took a step forward, as if trying to understand how this had come to be. Elias still didn't answer, only frowned as though trying to connect these events into a chain. "You still won't understand." He spoke quietly, almost to himself. Then he lifted his head, meeting Thomas's gaze, and said, "You have no idea what we've been through. And I can't let you leave here alive. The island, it's not just an island." Thomas took another step forward, but stopped again. "I'm not leaving this place. And if you really are from the crew, then you can help me, Elias." Those words changed everything. Elias carefully placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "If you want to survive on this island, you need to follow me, and remember this, don't trust anything you see. The island won't give anyone peace." Thomas felt the chill run down his spine. Thomas watched Elias closely, his heart beating faster because this man was alive and seemed to be hiding something. It all felt like some terrible nightmare, but there was no escape from it. The island, like its inhabitants, hid its secrets, and not everyone had the chance to uncover them. Elias silently led him deeper into the jungle, saying not a word. Thomas tried to start a conversation, but Elias only nodded, as if to say that his words wouldn't change anything at the moment. They passed through thickets where unfamiliar plants grew, and the air was thick with moisture and the spirit of the unknown. "What's going on this island?" Thomas asked, unable to bear the silence anymore. Elias stopped and finally replied, "You won't understand unless you see it with your own eyes. This island. It's not what it seems. There's something dark. Dangerous." Thomas steeled himself. He had to understand more to survive, to find some hope amidst the wilderness. "But there are people here. I saw them." Thomas pointed to some tracks nearby. "They looked like the ones you saw. They aren't people. They're those we once knew, or those the island has changed. Their goal is to destroy anyone who ends up here." Thomas stared at him in surprise. "But why are you still here? You could have left." Elias smiled bitterly. "This island doesn't let go. And I tried to escape, just like you. But everyone who tries ends up back here. It's a curse." Thomas fell silent, heavy thoughts tangled in his mind. His mind was struggling with what he had heard and seen. What kind of place was this? Why had he and the rest of the crew ended up here? And most importantly, how could they escape alive? Suddenly, a large cave appeared before them, its entrance hidden behind thick vines. Elias bent down, maneuvering through them, and Thomas followed. "This place has its secrets," Elias said as they stepped into the cave's darkness. Thomas couldn't help but notice how the atmosphere changed. The air became heavy, filled with the scent of antiquity and stagnation. "I found this hideout after the ship sank," Elias continued. "This is where I survived all this. But every time I tried to leave this island, I couldn't." Thomas looked around the cave. This wasn't just an ordinary cave. The walls were covered with strange drawings, resembling ancient symbols. They didn't seem like mere drawings, but maps, whose layout Thomas couldn't understand. "Is this a map?" he asked, leaning closer to examine the drawings. "Yes, but it's not just a map of this island. It's a map of all the places where other islands are, and perhaps a path that leads out of here." Thomas stared at the drawings, which intersected and led in different directions, extending far beyond this island. It looked like someone had already been searching for a way out. "But if these islands exist, why didn't you use this path?" Thomas asked, still struggling to believe what he was hearing. "Maybe I tried," Elias shrugged. "But this island changes. Once you find a path, it might disappear." It was becoming harder and harder for Thomas to believe what he was hearing. But he had no choice but to follow Elias and learn more. Perhaps they were the only ones who could uncover the island's secrets. At that moment, Thomas felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. His instincts kicked in immediately. They weren't alone here. "Get ready," Elias whispered, pulling a sharp stone from his hiding place. "It's not that simple here." Thomas and Elias emerged from the cave, leaving behind the last refuge of this cursed island. They had long since made the decision to leave this place. So, gathering the remnants of old ships that had been left on the shore, they began constructing a raft. Not a single one of their efforts could be in vain, and they worked tirelessly, regardless of exhaustion, to build a reliable means of escape from this doomed island. Meanwhile, the approaching storm threatened to destroy everything. Their raft was ready when the wind became unbearably strong. The waves were already crashing against the shore, and the sky grew darker. Thomas and Elias quickly launched the raft into the water, and without wasting any time, they pushed off from the shore. But the storm was intensifying. The waves lifted the raft, tossing it up and down. Every movement became heavy and dangerous. Hidden reefs beneath the water threatened to smash their only chance of survival. The wind howled, hindering their attempts to maneuver. They fought for every meter of water, knowing that staying in this storm on the raft meant certain death. They fought against nature, each time trying to push away from the approaching rocks and press on against the storm that wouldn't release them. Thomas felt the raft tossing relentlessly, offering no chance for rest. It seemed as though even the sea wanted to keep them here, on this cursed island. But they couldn't give up. The battle with nature continued, and only their determination and hope for salvation kept them going. Finally, after a long struggle, the sea began to calm. The waves no longer hit as forcefully, and they were able to drift toward calmer waters. They no longer felt the weight of the storm, and the sea became quiet and safe. Thomas and Elias were exhausted but alive, their hearts filled with hope for salvation. But there were still trials ahead, and they knew that their journey to civilization would be long and dangerous. Thomas sat in an old wooden chair by the fire, his eyes half-lidded with thick lashes, and in his gaze were traces of a long journey and a fight for survival. He slowly told his story to a young man named Samuel, who was listening attentively, sitting beside him and nervously glancing at the old sailor. Since we escaped the storm, we sailed towards the open ocean, choosing the best directions that could lead us away from that cursed island. There were days when we didn't even know if we were alive or if it was all over. But somehow, we made it to land. Again, just like before, we didn't know where we were heading. And how did you end up in that place? Samuel asked, looking at the old man with curiosity. It was a miracle, I would say, Thomas continued, his voice becoming quiet and thoughtful. We landed on shore, and it was a completely different land. It was a small harbor where merchant ships usually docked. But everything around was strange. Thank God, we were lucky. We found shelter, and for a time, the locals helped us. You left the island? Samuel asked, surprised at how easily Thomas could forget everything that had happened. I left. And it was a hard decision, but Elias and I quickly realized that, despite all the hardships, there was a chance for a new life. But this chance wasn't free. Thomas paused. I left that place because I understood one important thing: I could no longer return to that life. I felt that my purpose here, on land, might be different. And what happened next? Samuel asked. They offered me a job as a lighthouse keeper. The lighthouse shows the way to those who may get lost in the darkness and the storm. And I realized that this place was where I was meant to be. I became the one who helps and ensures that others don't end up in the same place I did. So, here I am, Samuel, telling you my story. Thomas raised his head and looked at the young man. His voice deepened. This place has become my home, and this lighthouse, my path in the darkness that leads to salvation.